welcome. Omega the Unknown is a classic late 70s series from Marvel Comics. The series, created and written by Steve Gerber and Mary Skrenes, was cancelled after only 10 issues due to low sales, leaving the overall story unfinished, despite the last issue promising it would be completed in the pages of the Defenders. Now, those familiar with Omega probably just went, "Hey, hold on now, the story was finished in the Defenders a few years later." Well, yes, that is true, but it wasn't a story written by either Steve or Mary. Therefore, the actual intended ending has never been written. First, let's get into the story in the Omega the Unknown comic book. Then we'll get into all the circumstances around it. The story begins with a highly intelligent, but socially inexperienced teenager named James Michael. This young man had been homeschooled by his parents all his life, and they decide he needs to attend a public school so he can finally meet, interact, and become accustomed to being around other people. While driving James Michael to his first day at school, the car crashes, and James Michael discovers his parents are actually robots. He lapses into a coma and wakes up a month later in a New York hospital. His calm, detached acceptance of being an orphan is more than a little alarming to the hospital staff. Eventually, due to budgeting issues, James Michael is released into the custody of his nurse, Ruth, and her roommate, Amber. From there, James Michael attends school while living with Ruth and Amber in a New York slum. While learning to adapt to life as one of the less fortunate in society, he also gets an education about the violence of modern life. Running parallel to this story is the struggles of Omega, a warrior that escaped to Earth following a battle with a horde of robots. For the most part, Omega's adventures on Earth are him doing battles with bad guys, and it's the basic superhero requirement of a comic book. However, Omega himself is enigmatic. While we do get an omniscient monologue about the character, Omega doesn't actually speak until the 4th issue, and following that, he doesn't say much at all. There is an unexplained connection between Omega and James Michael. James Michael seems to dream about Omega's adventures, and he feels Omega's pain. And one of the robots that follow Omega to Earth seems to believe James Michael is as equally threatening as Omega. Overall, it's the elements and the characters of the series that are compelling, rather than the stories themselves. Actually, let me rephrase that. The episodic superhero fights bad guy parts are underwhelming in comparison to the overall story. These parts were, well, requirements at the time, I suppose, and necessary to the overall story to a degree. But to be perfectly honest, they're as boring as hell. James Michael's story is very street level, and it explores the good and bad elements of one tiny, poor community set within a bustling metropolis. Steve and Mary get as close as they can to pointing out, for example, that this character is an alcoholic hustler, and this character is a prostitute, and this is her pimp, without directly saying that's exactly who they are. I mean, it's pretty risque stuff for a mid-70s mainstream comic book. It's all these unique elements that make the series a cult classic, rather than the actual unfinished story itself. It was a series that tried to be more than its superhero requirements, and it never quite gets to where it was going because, well, it was cancelled. The series was reportedly cancelled due to low sales, and that may, in part, be true, but it certainly isn't the entire truth. So let's get into the circumstances surrounding the series itself. The series came about due to Steve Gerber's early success at Marvel Comics. At the time, he was a freelance writer and editor for the company, and that put him in a position to directly pitch ideas to Stan Lee. Both Howard the Duck and Omega the Unknown were pitched at the same time and approved by Stan himself. Mary Skrenes, the co-writer of the Omega series, was a relatively unknown name at the time the comic book started, and that was mainly due to, well, I gotta call it as I see it, outright sexism. Mary had written horror comics at DC, but she was forced to use the pseudonym Virgil North on that work, and the work she did prior to assuming that name, mainly on romance comics for DC, went uncredited. In fact, Mary's first mainstream credit under her own name didn't occur for 3 years into her career in the pages of Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. This lack of credit and the use of a male pseudonym occurred because it was an industry standard, or let's call it an industry misconception, that readers would reject superhero or horror stories written by a woman. One of the most notable credit oversights is that Mary and Steve plotted both Omega the Unknown and Howard the Duck together. However, due to the aforementioned social atmosphere at the time, she was not given credit for her work on Howard. The only actual credit she gets concerning Howard was that she was the basis for the supporting character, Beverly Switzler. With Omega, Steve and Mary were given the opportunity to do whatever they wanted within reason and with minimal editorial interference. But the titles still had to be produced on a regular bi-monthly schedule. Unfortunately, Steve fell behind on just about all his editorial and writing duties during the course of the series. Omega was written by 2 other writers for 2 issues, and these issues really stand out within the run, mainly because the James Michaels story goes completely untouched for 2 issues, and the stories are basically 20 pages of Omega fighting someone. Additionally, Omega gets kind of chatty. Prior to that, Omega had said exactly 1 word. But in both issues 7 and 8, Omega has no issue saying mostly unnecessary dialogue. Mary was unimpressed by these fill-in issues, while Steve rolled with it, understanding that the comic had to come out regularly. However, Mary's opinion appeared to be that Omega was their sole creative effort, despite the demands of publishing. Furthermore, she believed these fill-in issues were editorial exerting some petty amount of control over the Omega series and, by extension, the writers themselves. So the autonomy Mary and Steve were led to believe they had concerning the series was an illusion. Around the time of the final 2 issues of Omega, Steve Gerber was rapidly coming to the end of his career as a Marvel writer and editor. This was all due to him beginning his legal claim to Howard the Duck. Once legal proceedings around that claim started, Gerber was basically fired by Marvel Comics. Of course, they claimed Gerber was delinquent in his duties, requiring a termination of contract. But the actual reason for his dismissal was Marvel wasn't going to continually cut him a paycheck that would ultimately fund the lawsuit against them. Basically, Omega the Unknown was a casualty of the Howard the Duck lawsuit. It was likely cancelled because of this, rather than low sales. After all, until the Omega story was concluded in the Defenders title, that series was inundated with letters from fans asking when they'd see the promised ending. So it seems to me that the Omega series was selling reasonably well since it inspired a massive outcry for an ending. But that's speculation. Following this cancellation, Mary Skrenes left New York and quit the comic book industry entirely. Despite the promise that she and Steve Gerber would write a conclusion to the Omega story, she actually had no intention of ever doing so. As she saw it, the 2 fill-in issues were a sign that editorial were not going to honor the freedom she and Steve had been promised. I'd also speculate a bit further and suggest that Mary's experience working in the comics industry was less than ideal, and there was literally no incentive for her to continue pursuing a career in that field. Steve's intentions were, well, I couldn't find anything that indicated his intentions. I would have to presume he had a pragmatic take on the whole situation. In other words, he likely gave the Omega series no thought once he was let go from Marvel, and I doubt he believed that they would ask him to finish the story due to the circumstances surrounding his dismissal. All of this begs the question, did Mary and Steve have an actual ending or a resolution in mind? They did, according to interviews. However, they also swore they'd keep the ending a secret, and, to their credit, neither have given the slightest indication concerning what the conclusion might entail. So, for all intents and purposes, Omega the Unknown will always remain an enigmatic, unresolved series. There are, in fact, 2 conclusions to the Omega the Unknown series. Sort of. The first ending appeared in Defenders numbers 76 and 77, and it is, well, less than satisfying. But it is a definitive conclusion nonetheless. However, the reason that ending exists is because Marvel editorial wanted to stop being flooded with letters asking for an ending to the Omega saga. My point being, this ending was not inspired. It's simply there to tie up dangling plot threads and to shut up fans of the series. The second ending came about in the 2008 Omega the Unknown miniseries, written by best-selling author Jonathan Lethem. This series, also 10 issues long, is a reimagining of the characters and concepts from the original series. It deviates greatly from the source material and, for better or for worse, becomes its own unique thing. Personally, I thought this series tried too hard to be offbeat and quirky, and, ultimately, the material didn't connect with me, which I think has more to do with my own tastes than the material itself. It's something I may have to reread in the future before I can develop a useful opinion on it, because right now I don't really have one. With the exception of this recent miniseries, the Omega character and the supporting cast have been completely absent in the Marvel universe. There's never been a revival or a guest appearance or any indication that these characters ever existed within the mainstream Marvel continuity, even though they obviously did. I can only speculate as to why this is the case. I think it's a mixture of no writer wanting to revive a character that embodies the specific vision of 2 creators. And there's the possibility that, at the time, Marvel didn't want to engage in another potential lawsuit with Steve Gerber over character ownership. so they let the Omega concept slip into obscurity. Over time, well, the series has become a somewhat forgotten cult classic. That's it for today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will talk at you later. Until next time.